asked to talk about consumers. Now, I was really happy to watch that very first film today, because the very first thing we saw was people, consumers and their loved brands. Yeah? And consumers are really important in this whole equation because we are consumers, and we buy that stuff that gets produced through really complex supply chains. And so it's really important to think about how people behave as consumers. And yes, we are all consumers. So our topic was consumer practices, are they ethical or flexible? And I'm not going to talk about this because really we haven't been properly introduced, so there's no point in that. But we are going to begin by sort of looking at consumption generally. And what is it all about? What role does consumption play in our daily lives? And so before we can start to sort of unpick it and talk about whether or not it's ethical or flexible, we need to think about consumption more generally. We'll then move on to the criticisms and in fact what people can do in terms of ethical behaviour through consumption, main challenges, but also how these challenges can be addressed. Right, so there we go again, Google Images. But we just wanted to make it a bit more colourful because we didn't have a film to show today. But anyway, so the first thing to say, I suppose, is that consumption is symbolic. Right? We all convey something, meanings, through our consumer practices. And so consumption enables us to establish our standing in society. We derive pleasure from consuming. Yeah? We like to buy, we like to shop, we enjoy ourselves when we're shopping. It's about identity formation. Yeah? Consumption says something about who we are and what groups we belong to. Yeah? So who do we identify with? But also, who are we distinct from? What groups do we want to distance ourselves from? And this is particularly relevant when it comes to fashion and so on. And so, critiques of consumption have been around for many, many years, and actually, I dare say centuries, if you think about the book written by Veblen. But there are conflicts and challenges in Western consumption models. And, of course, you've all probably heard of these criticisms before. So, the issue of increased materialism and excess consumption, you know, what are we doing? Are we creating increasingly materialistic societies, and where are we going to stop with it? Do we just keep buying more cheap stuff? And how are things being produced? Things don't always necessarily increase happiness. So there was that famous New Economics Foundation report a while back, several years back now, that actually compared happiness levels between the 70s and now, and how actually our happiness hasn't really increased as a result of our increased consumption levels. Again, criticisms with regards to how we are impinging our materialistic values upon other cultures, and the fact that, of course, global resources are finite and we can't keep consuming the environment in such a rate, because that's going to cause a lot of problems. And so the social impact, and of course we've been talking about all the social issues thoroughly this morning, and where does all the waste go? What do we do with our disposable waste and our fast fashion consumption and so on? It's not always a good thing. It has been said that consumption is not always a good thing, and that shopping is the nation's new disorder, because we do that as a hobby nowadays. Instead of spending time with our family and, you know, socializing with people, we actually go down the mall because that's the interesting, the fun thing to do. And this is quite important. I think that this is where we need to tackle some issues. The disconnect between production and consumption. And in fact, if you think about it, right, because we're so tied into consuming all the time, we don't really see or pay attention to what's going on in the production line. And because it's so far away from us, in a different country even, we're not interested, and we just trust implicitly. We trust those loved brands and what they're doing. We'll just outsource that worry to the companies themselves. And so there's an increased disconnect between production and consumption, and of course marketing. Sometimes we come from a marketing background, and so marketing gets blamed for it all. a lot of the time, and I've worked in advertising as well, which makes me a really bad person. But despite the criticisms, right, we need to think about the fact that it's part of our system, and so consumption actually fuels the global economy, and it does do a lot of good. And of course, we also need to think about the issues of inequality and the fact that poorer nations perhaps need to raise their standards of living, and of course we've done it, why they not allowed to do so? You know, who decides what's good consumption and bad consumption? Who is going to tell us what we should and shouldn't consume? And, you know, isn't that elitist? Isn't that, you know, something that the affluent like to say because they can buy more expensive stuff that's produced ethically because that's sold at a premium? And of course, the issue of hypocrisy is often highlighted. Consumption is not inherently a bad thing. Why is it a bad thing? And actually, we need to still remember that there's a lot of poverty around, even in the UK. And not everyone has got enough to have a decent standard of living. And this is the most important thing, I think. That we need to remember that all forms of consumption are at some level ethical, because we often express love and care through consumption. Yeah, and I put that image there on purpose. Yeah, we're buying something for a loved one, and we're saying how much we care about them through an object, whatever that might be. And so that in itself says something about who we are and how we express our feelings through consumption.
In the kind of research that we've been doing, one of the things we try and identify is, you know, is a consumer ethical? Or really what's going on is that we're actually quite flexible in our approach to our consumption behaviour. So one of the things we always find out is when we start to talk to people about being an ethical consumer, they immediately reject the label. They don't like to be called ethical. They're actually quite uncomfortable with it. And what we try and say to them is that when we're talking about an ethical consumer, what we're talking about is someone whose choices go beyond just the economic. In other words, they don't just think about the price, they think about some of the morals and some of the other issues that surround the product that they're buying. And you'll find that a lot of consumers will actually use their consumption as a political tool. They'll make certain choices, they'll boycott, in other words, buy certain things, like say fair trade products, and they'll boycott, they'll reject certain things. And that's a political statement that they're making through their consumption. But it's very difficult to actually get people to change their behaviour. And when you're talking about the people who are not terribly engaged with these issues, how do you actually get them to change their consumption? Because there's a lot of considerations go into why people buy the things they do, as Caroline was alluding to. It's not just about being kind-hearted or selfless. That's not necessarily why people make certain choices in their consumption that we would consider to be ethical. And I think one of the most difficult choices about being an ethical consumer, perhaps, is it's not just about consuming less. There's two arguments go on. There's the argument that says we should actually buy less and stop being so materialistic and impulsive in our consumption. But actually, there's another argument that says, well, you know, keep buying, but buy more of the right things. And sometimes those two issues are really in quite considerable conflict. If you look at how the market's behaving, you'll actually see that, you know, since back in 1999, which is roughly the period that I guess got into this area, there has been an increase in ethical spending, and it's been spread across different categories. So you'll see that, you know, at the moment, ethical investment is very popular. You know, it's quite economically driven, but people have sort of recognised that, you know, ethical companies are actually going to give them quite a good return on their investment. The ethical food and drink market, I think, is the one we're probably most familiar with, because that's the one that's most accessible to people. But others are growing: eco-travel, personal products, green home, you know, the eco-homes. That's all a series of growing markets that people are starting to buy into. But, and this is a quote from Barry Craven in the Co-op Bank, says, let's not lose sight of the fact that ethical sales remain a small proportion of total sales. In other words, it's still a niche market, relatively speaking to the rest of the market. And that, you know, ultimately, over and above all the efforts of responsible business and, you know, some of you guys out there, ethical consumers, really we need a bigger push than that. We need some kind of government commitment to long-term intervention. It's not going to happen downstream. There has to be some top-down push for this as well. So what are the main challenges? Well, I think one of the biggest problems is that, as Caroline was saying, the social and environmental impacts of the things we buy are not visible to us. We don't see them. When we walk in, to Zara, we walk into H&M, we don't see anything about where that garment's been produced. We know nothing about that. We're not even thinking about that. We're just thinking, or certainly when I talk to my daughter, it's about, what's the next picture you're going to put on Facebook or BBM of you in your nice new outfit. Those things are invisible. I think one of the other challenges to persuading consumers to behave differently is that the whole image around ethical consumption is something they're quite challenged by. There was a really interesting phrase that a couple of our colleagues came up with. It's the perceptions of a colder and darker place with less choice and comfort. Well, who's going to go down that road? Who's going to say, well, if you go and buy these things, it's going to be much more unpleasant? And that's how people see that change in their buying behaviour. The other thing that we find, and certainly in research terms, is that you go and you talk to people and they do have the right attitude about how you should behave, but they don't actually do it. They behave differently. And this attitude-behaviour gap, that's the one that needs to be addressed. That's where the intervention needs to take place. And the truth is that we all struggle with our consumption choices. We're locked into our consumption patterns. We have habits. There are social norms that we feel we have to live up to. We have restricted choices, there are barriers, there's all sorts of incentives. It's easy if you live in top nets, where the high street is populated with organic cafes and ethical stores. It's much more difficult if you live in a place like Shard End and Birmingham, which is actually almost a food desert. And the other thing that comes out from changing your consumption behaviour is there's less of this post-shopping regret. There's a lot of research being done on this about people, buying all this stuff, but then sinking into shame and depression and probably worse, huge amounts of debt that are being fueled by our compulsive, if you like, consumption behaviour. Choice editing is a great way of fixing it. I know we've got some from Sainsbury's here, but Sainsbury's have said, right, all our bananas are fair trade, all our coffee's fair trade, all our tea's fair trade. There's been a big debate about how we need more choice. Actually, we probably need less. And we probably need someone to make those choices for us, so it's not so confusing when we go into the stores and the supermarket. It's been very effective with white goods. They've taken away the less environmentally friendly white goods. And now we don't have a choice but to buy, a certain kind of product. And that can be done. It can be very successful. Catalytic individuals. The power of word of mouth is really important. We did some research looking at Modbury in Devon, who became the first plastic bag-free town. And Rebecca Hoskins, who was a BBC camerawoman, was the catalytic individual there, who just decided to go in there and change things in her town. And she got her friends on board, and then they got the retailers on board, and before you knew it, it was a very successful project. So getting those people to spread the word, talking about these issues. I spend my life talking to friends who couldn't care less about these issues, and they think I'm just kind of mouthy academic. But the more I talk to them about it, the more they become aware of these issues. And when we did the research on the jewellery industry with the consumers, who many of them were ethical consumers when it came to things like their food and their waste, when we started to talk to them about jewellery, they were saying, oh, I didn't think about that. I never thought about that in jewellery. Next time I go to buy a piece of jewellery, I will start asking these questions of the retailers. So making us talk about it is actually quite important, and there's a role to be played for communications to do that. And social marketing, intervention. Social marketing is all about identifying why people won't change their behaviour, the challenges they find to that change, and putting in interventions to help them to do it, because they can't do it by themselves. And understanding that this is all well and good, but people love fashion because it makes them look good. And that has to be part of the conversation. It can't all be just about the worthiness of changing your behaviour. So, consumption plays a very important role in our life. There's lots of critiques in our life about it. Ethical consumption has huge challenges, really, that we need to overcome. But there are ways that can be done. And I think what we feel, speaking to the people that we speak to, that, yes, you have to do the grand narratives and you have to do the grand changes and you have to get government and regulators involved. But you can start with quite small changes with the individual consumers, and those two can build up a momentum. And it's all about getting more people involved.